so you will see me quite a lot here. And today we have a bunch of very interesting speakers, and right now I want to ask yourself a question: what is the future of intimacy? Because we are always thinking about the future of finance, of insurance, of pharmaceutical markets, etc. But what about the relationships? How will they change with the coming of new technologies? And today we have our next speaker, who is a co-founder of award-winning British pleasure brand MysteryVibe. And I didn't mistake here, so I told this pleasure brand. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to IT Arena stage sex tech expert and enthusiast, Stephanie Alys.
Thank you. Oh, what an absolute pleasure it is to be here. My first time in Ukraine. You've made me feel very welcome. You have a very beautiful city. Thank you very much. I love my job because I put one word on the screen and already I see smiles. Sex. We live in a world surrounded by sex. It's everywhere. Sex sells our cars. It sells our perfume. It sells our fashion. It dominates our music, our online media, and our movies. It keeps us up late at night, and it sometimes wakes us up early in the morning. Sex is the reason we invented online payments and video streaming, thanks to pornography. And sex is one of the few things that is actually making money in things like virtual reality today. Sex is something that can be anything. It can be adventurous. It can be wild, extreme, violent. But it can also be soft, sensual, and sensitive. Sex is existential. It's the reason you exist. You would not be here sitting in this wonderful room today if two people hadn't have had sex. And when I was young, my parents taught me one of the most important lessons that I learned, that sex is natural, part of being human, and nothing to be ashamed of. But as I grew older, I became so fascinated by the fact something so natural, so innate to us as human beings, remained such a taboo. And there were still so many stigmas around it. So come with me today, and let's go on a trip into the future of sex. And I'm not just talking about tonight, or tomorrow, or this weekend, or the next time you get into bed with your partner. I'm talking maybe 10, 20, even 30 years into the future. What does this future world look like? What does your sex look like? Perhaps some of the more kinky of you in the audience are already starting to picture some gadgets, some kind of technology, maybe a virtual reality headset or whatever we're using for that, Google Glass, some kind of smart sex toy, or maybe even a sex robot, or 2 or 3. I'm not judging. Technology has driven us forward in so many areas of life, as Oksana was saying, giving us greater access to things like health, travel, finance, and education. We can see the very obvious benefits of broadening our horizons with technology, of exploring new ideas, and having more tools to help us navigate our increasingly difficult and busy day-to-day lives. But when we talk about sex and technology, it's often in terms that are a bit abstract or dystopian. And when we come from a technology space and we start talking about users, it becomes a bit impersonal and disconnected. So a few years ago, I co-founded a company called MysteryVibe. And as part of my work, a big part of my work is researching trends in sex, in pleasure, in society. And I also develop products that are designed to enhance and elevate people's sex lives. And one of the most common questions I hear is, why? why do we even need technology in our bedroom? After all, as I said, sex is intimate and animal. We're used to linking it with things like love, relationships, personal connections between two people. What possible contribution could cold algorithms and shiny gadgets make that could improve something so personal as intimacy? Well, I'd argue it can do a lot. Technology is already improving our sex lives and our relationships in many ways, from the way that we meet each other to the way that we connect with each other. And with the right approach in the future, it can continue to do so, bringing us closer together by helping us exploring our bodies, exploring our fantasies, and our partners, and the ways in which we connect with each other. Technology isn't just some fun addition to sex. It's a tool that we can use to explore some of the big, important questions about what really makes us human. So what I want to do in the next, I'd say, 25 to 30 minutes or so, is take a look at where we are now as a society, where we're going 10, 20, maybe 30 years in the future, and talk to you about some of the things that I think are very important to consider when we're talking about the future of intimacy and the future of sex and technology. I'm going to leave maybe 10 or so minutes for questions, so get thinking of those now. I know you're a very intelligent audience, so you're going to have some very intelligent questions. So where are we at right now? Well, like I said, I do a lot of research into trends in sex and in pleasure. And I can't share all of that with you today, but I did want to share 3 key things that I think are influencing the way we're thinking about sex, the way we're talking about sex, and the kinds of products that we're developing for the future of sex. Now, the first thing I want to talk to you about is something I call novel escapism. Now, the growth and the rise and the development of our internet has brought with it a revolution in pornography. And it's becoming increasingly hardcore. More people visit porn sites than Netflix and Amazon combined. Porn is one of the most popular things, if not the most popular thing, on the internet when it comes to traffic. And with this constant flow of imagery that is becoming more and more hardcore, people are searching further for novel things, for new things to excite them. And as the mainstream begins to embrace what was previously seen as something for the weird, kinky, strange few people on the fringes of society, as we're bringing these concepts into the mainstream, the borders of what is seen as accepted are continually being pushed outwards. And as this explicit and somewhat overly pornographic imagery goes from porn and enters the mainstream and becomes more prominent, we've started to see a real explosion in the soft pornography genre, and it's gained huge popularity from things like 50 Shades of Grey, I'm sure many of you have heard of 50 Shades of Grey, to even things like Twilight or Game of Thrones. So we've seen an explosion of this media tapping into a need for escapism, a need to flee reality. It's also one of the reasons we've seen so many people who love to binge on TV and on drama and on film, because we want to escape our day-to-day lives and flee into some kind of fiction, some amazing reality. The second trend that I'm seeing across the world, pretty much everywhere, is an opening of minds. Now, I don't mean that this is happening in every single community in the world. There are some places where we're standing still, or perhaps even going backwards slightly. But I see this broad trend of us becoming more liberal when it comes to sex and sexuality. It used to be that we would think of sex in terms of gender. Men like this, women like this. Men are from Mars, women are from Venus, and their sexual tastes will be very similarly split. But as a society, we're starting to recognize the fluidity of gender, of masculinity and of femininity, and changing gender roles. We've also seen a huge rise, for example, in LGBTQ issues being discussed openly and being accepted. It was only a couple of weeks ago that even in India, a country which is very is not as progressive as others when it comes to sex and sexuality, passed or overturned a law which said homosexuality was illegal. So we're seeing this broad trend towards discussing these things and it becoming much more accepted. And we're also seeing a real diversification of what we understand the word sex to actually mean. It used to be that we would think of sex as something that would happen, or as intercourse between a man and a woman as part of a marriage to bring a child into the family. Whereas now, we've really started to redefine the word. And people talk about sex when it comes to even things like deep kissing or sexting, sending explicit images to a partner or to anyone. Or even things like kinks and fetishes are now being brought under this broad umbrella of what sex and intimacy is. And then thirdly, we've seen this huge rise and this huge change in terms of how we're thinking about health. And we're rethinking what I'm calling holistic well-being. Now, well-being has become an increasingly hot topic across the entire world. The rise of wearables that track your fitness, the growth of luxury fitness wear, and the huge rise of mindfulness and meditation points to the fact that we're becoming much more aware, much more conscious, and caring so much more about not just our physical health, but also our mental health. And the next big thing, which I think we're going to try to tackle, is stress. Stress has a huge impact on everything else when it comes to your health and your well-being, your mental health, your physical health. And sex plays a huge role when we're thinking about well-being from a very holistic perspective. Sex stimulates your brain. It improves your sleep. It improves your immune system, your heart health. It improves your confidence across all areas of your life, from your career to your relationships, to your friendships, to your relationship with yourself and your own body. It can even have a big effect on things like reducing chronic pain for people who have conditions. Sex plays such a has a humongous impact on your day-to-day physical and mental health. And yet, despite these three key things, despite our searching for novel things that surprise and excite us, despite this opening of minds to talk about more things when it comes to sex, despite the key impact it has on your health and your well-being, our first experience of trying to understand sex and what it is and what it means to us as humans is very non-technological and also incredibly simplistic. Now, someone put their hand up if they thought they had good sex education. I don't know what sex education is like here in Ukraine, but in UK, it's awful. It's really, really bad. As young people, as children, we're taught very little, if anything at all, about sex. Perhaps we're taught what body part goes where and when. We're separated into different rooms of boys and girls to talk about puberty. We maybe get to look at a condom, put it on a banana. Did anyone else do that? We're taught about sexually transmitted infection. We're taught very, very little, if anything at all, about pleasure, about actually having a nice time and enjoying it. Now, we call this model of sex education the plumbing and prevention model. It gives you the very basic ingredients that you need to avoid complete disaster, but it doesn't actually give you anything to aspire to. It doesn't say, this is what you should be looking for, or this is how you should feel. And so many people leave education thinking about sex as if it's some kind of formula or some kind of instruction manual. First you do this, then you do this, then you do this, and then you're done. And so for most people, sex as a concept is shrouded in mystery, in giggles, and in shame. And so we learn by osmosis. We learn from our friends. We learn from pornography. And these mediums, pornography especially, teach us about sex from an incredibly limited and limiting perspective. I mean, imagine if we taught about something else so fundamental to us as human beings, like food, the same way we're taught about sex. If at school, you were taught eating was about taking something, putting it in your mouth, chewing it, and swallowing, and that's it. If in the media, different articles about food were things like 25 ways to chew your food, or 5 ways to hold your knife and fork, without any of the joy or the context surrounding sex, or surrounding food, or the way that sometimes you might want to grab a quick sandwich or have a 5-course meal with wine. Or imagine if we were taught that every single meal you have for your entire life has to include one ingredient, say bread, or it wasn't really a meal at all. The pleasure that we get from food is not in chewing and swallowing. Just like the pleasure that we get from sex isn't in what body part goes where and when. Sex isn't about actions or a specific set of instructions. It's about sensations, emotions, and the connection between 2 or more people. So it's very important that the sex tech that we create helps to elevate the conversation around sex. Now, what does this mean for the future of sex and the way that we develop new technology for pleasure? Well, after all, when we hear about shiny new apps in the media or robots that will fulfill your every desire, so often the stories focus on what is going to happen. This thing vibrates. This thing connects with your pornography. You can connect it to your virtual reality headset. But while all these features and these options might be fun, it's not important what sex tech does. What's important is how it makes you feel. And this is something that I take with me as I travel the world and I talk to different people in different cultures about sex, intimacy, and technology. And when people find out that I work in this industry and I talk about sex all day, they suddenly feel incredibly open with me and they want to tell me all of their stories. They tell me things that have happened to them in the past, the things that they want to happen. And I get so many questions. Questions like, how do I get my partner to do this? Is this normal? Do other people do this or think this? Will I have to use technology in my bedroom in the future? Will it change the way that I have sex? What's going to happen if it gets hacked? Aren't people having less sex with technology these days anyway? And my absolute favorite question of them all, well, with all of these sex robots coming, are humans even going to bother having sex with humans anymore? And I thought about this for a long time, and I thought about all the questions that people ask me, and I realized that all of the questions boil down to one thing: fear. Fear that you're not normal. Fear of what other people might think if they found out what you did in your bedroom. And on one hand, it's not surprising that something that society has made us feel so much shame about for our entire lives, made us feel so inadequate, made us feel so weird, so dirty, also makes us feel scared. And ironically, it's this exact same fear that helps those taboos persist. While we're busy worrying about what others think, or that we're doing something wrong, or that technology is coming to correct us or replace us, we're buying into this idea that there is a right and a wrong way to have sex, and that someday someone is going to stop by our bedrooms and tell us we're doing it wrong. Now, these fears, they're not new. They're actually pretty common. When basic vibrators started to become popular, men worried that they were going to be replaced. And they're still worried about it. I get that question pretty much every day. Every new media advancement, whether it's VHS, DVD, even now virtual reality, has been accompanied by this panic that in making pornography more accessible to people, it will destroy human-to-human intimacy. Even things like Grindr or Tinder, when they first came out, people were terrified that they were going to stop people from falling in love or that they would commoditize relationships. What do all these fears have in common? In all of them, the things that we love the most about sex, the intimacy, the pleasure, the connection between people, they're absent. Humans are replaced or they're upgraded. And the ways in which we date, have relationships, and experience each other become less human. That technology is there to get in the way, that it's going to be a barrier to human intimacy. And if you look at the media that we put out there, for example, Westworld, Black Mirror, Ex Machina, have people seen these films that have sex or the future of sex and robots? Most of the stories that we are telling about the future of sex imply that as we progress, we move further away from human connection and we replace it with technology. Whether that's someone sitting in their bedroom alone, masturbating with virtual reality, or falling in love with a sex robot. But what if there's a slightly different way to approach the future of sex? What if technology isn't seen as a barrier to intimacy, but as a bridge? There's no point just looking at sexy gadgets and apps. We need to understand what effects they are having on the people that are using them. Do they help us learn more about ourselves? Do they help us learn more about each other? Do they help us achieve more pleasure? Or share our fantasies more easily with our partners? How does this particular product make you feel? Now, these are the questions that I want you to keep in mind when we talk and we think about the future of sex and technology. So what are some of the interesting developments we're seeing now, and how are they going to help us explore some of these questions? Well, my favorite example when I'm talking about this is virtual reality. Because I think while it's being used for some very simple applications now, it has a lot of potential when we're talking about the future. Now, right now, at the moment, if you have a virtual reality headset, you can use it as an enhancement of 2D pornography, or perhaps at the top end, you could connect it to some piece of hardware, which means you can feel tactile, haptic sensations at the same time as you're watching things. But as the price comes down, and as we improve technology, you'll start looking at real-time interactions through virtual reality in a virtual space. So, for example, you could put on your headset, you could connect to someone somewhere in the world, you could go for a walk in the park with them, you could go to the cinema with them, and you could even have sex with them through this virtual space. Now, while this is often used as a good example of how couples in long-distance relationships can stay connected to each other and experience each other more easily and more frequently, what's interesting to me is the idea that you could have a full romantic and sexual relationship with someone you've never even met in real life before through this VR. So you would, like I say, put on your headset, you'd connect to that person, and then you could go on a date together, or you could spend the evening together, or you could have sex with that person. And that's the instruction manual, if you like. That's the ABC, the features. But what about some of the feelings and the deeper questions that we could ask about this? How does this technology help us explore our underlying desires? Well, if you were dating someone and you had this full romantic and sexual relationship entirely in the virtual space, how would our criteria for sexual compatibility change? If you're never going to meet someone in real life, be in the same room as we are today, then the things that you would swipe for on Tinder, eye color, hair color, body type, start becoming less and less relevant. And we start asking questions like, what do I find sexy about the way someone behaves? About the way they talk? About the language they use? What are their erotic qualities beyond the physical? Now, this isn't just a simple rehashing of the old phrase, personality is more important than looks. I'm not saying that in virtual reality, looks will be an unimportant consideration. It's just that this kind of idea encourages you to think more about how much pleasure we get from different kinds of criteria and where our priorities for pleasure and connection and compatibility lie. What's more, it's not just about how other people look in virtual reality. You could also change your own avatar. You could make yourself taller, shorter. You could change your body type. You could even change your genitalia. You could have sex as someone from a different gender, or of a different ethnicity, different background. You could even have sex as an alien. So as you can see, as we drill down into some of the potential and some of the possibilities and some of the questions when it comes to virtual reality and sex, it's not the technology itself that's interesting. It's about how these things can help you explore your desires, explore your fantasies in new ways that you never have before. What virtual reality does is less important than how it makes you feel and the opportunities that it gives you to explore your own desires. Like I say, it's not important what the sex tech does. What's important is how it makes you feel and question things around sexuality, pleasure, and relationships. And if we extrapolate this thinking out to other areas of sexuality, it becomes easier to think of the ways in which technology can help us experience more humanity, not less. Say, for example, I'm low on confidence, and I've got no idea how to approach someone in a bar and chat them up. Maybe I could download some kind of relationship coach to my phone that would give me timely, confidence-boosting messages or suggest different ways that I could arrange my photos in my dating profile. Or if I have no luck there, I could try my hand at virtual dating. Just as you use virtual reality to have dates and have sex with people, maybe you could try speed dating in virtual reality, sitting in your living room, comfortable, confident, with a nice glass of wine, and you could meet people through a virtual space, which would give you time to figure out whether or not you wanted to actually meet them in real life. Or perhaps it could be a smart vibrator that knows exactly how to give you pleasure or how to bring you to orgasm. You could use this with a new partner. Or perhaps you'd be in that virtual space and you could connect that thing you're seeing to how you're feeling and live out fantasies that wouldn't be possible in real life today. Or, if that didn't work, maybe you could enjoy some solo sex on your own. Advances in neurotechnology could give us chips in our brain that would give us direct stimulation. Who fancies orgasms on demand? Or maybe even the ability to give yourself orgasmic, lucid dreams. Because ultimately, this is what technology should be doing. It should be enabling us to be more human, not less. We should be able to use technology to help us, whether that's creating the right conditions to have sex, or perhaps providing us with more insight about ourselves and our partners, or to help us meet each other and learn things about each other that we would never know before. It's not just helping kinky people become kinkier. When we start thinking about some of these underlying questions around sex, we can also come up with some incredibly powerful examples of people who don't or can't have sex suddenly becoming more able. How can we help people who don't, at the moment, have healthy sex lives to learn more about themselves and to experience pleasure and sex like we do? So as a sex tech company or a brand or a person in this space, how do you keep on top of these ideas? How do you make sure that you're prompting people to ask more questions about themselves and their own pleasure, rather than falling into some trap of giving them this instruction manual that we talked about with sex education in the past? When we first started our company, MysteryVibe, we identified what we thought was a big problem: the distractions that technology is causing in the bedroom. As we get older and our lives get more complicated and work gets busier, technology is constantly distracting us. You have constant notifications, messages, emails, agendas, to-dos, and this can really make it so much harder to switch off from your busy, busy work life and switch on when it comes to sex and your partner and your pleasure. But is this problem really a technology one? Phones, laptops, and all kinds of things for technology can be used for pleasure too, whether that's watching porn with your partner or using an app that prompts you to have a conversation with your partner about different kinks or things you might like to try. Just as technology can help us email work at 11 p.m. or midnight to respond to something super urgent, it can also help us to engage in different ways in our romantic and sexual relationships. And when your grandmother or your parents tell you to get off your phone and have a real conversation with a real person, what they don't realize is that's actually what you're doing on your phone. You're having a conversation with someone. Because when it comes down to it, technology is fundamentally about relationships. So instead of trying to solve a particular problem, it's important for sex and technology, to help us facilitate those relationships, to make it easier for us to connect with our partners and prompt you to think about your own and their pleasure. We shouldn't be giving people instructions, but we should be helping people, giving them a platform to explore their own desires and their own sexualities, because there are as many sexualities as there are people on this planet. Now, I'm a firm believer that technology in itself isn't good, it isn't bad. It's a product of our society and of our culture. And it's very understandable that in our culture, which still has so many hang-ups about sex from the past, that we should worry about the ways in which technology might carry these forward into the future. And as my very close friend Monica says, the fictions we tell always bleed back into reality. The stories we tell, the stories in our media, the stories in our films, become the future. And often, engineers in technology will look to things like sci-fi, fantasy, and film to create a very literal roadmap when designing and bringing a product to market. It's very simple. A society that believes that human relationships are unnecessary will likely create technology that keeps us further apart rather than bringing us together. A society which sees sex as purely for procreation purposes won't think about things like pleasure and connection and intimacy that we've talked about today. And if we sit back passively and we let that technology wash over us, that's exactly what's going to happen. For me, the future of sex isn't about shiny gadgets or algorithms. Though those will be there, they'll be somewhere in the background. For me, it's about how this technology helps us learn more about ourselves and about our sexuality. Technology isn't something that happens to us. It's something that we create. Now, I can stand here and I can make predictions about what kind of gadgets and tech we're going to have in the future. But the really exciting thing is that it's not down to me. It's not my decision. The future of sex and the future of tech will grow out of what society wants and what we actually use these technologies for, what we accept and what we reject, and what we really desire. Technology should help us become more human. And if we take a very active role in its development, by trying new products, by exploring them with our partners, and by discussing the new things that we've learned about each other or that we feel, we can help to create a future that is based on pleasure, on understanding, and on acceptance. So when we're thinking about the future of sex, whether that's 10 years or 20 years or 30, we need to stop asking, what will happen in the future? And instead, we need to ask the question, what kind of future do we want to create? I'll leave you with that question. Thank you very much. And I will actually take your questions.
So, Stephanie, thank you so much for this type of speech. And you know, these kind of speeches are not frequent here on this stage or somewhere else in, not IT arena, even space. So about the sex education in Ukraine, I think that this is the same as in Great Britain, but even worse. And right now we have questions part. So guys, who is like brave enough to start? Yeah, Ivan, it's you. Yeah, a guy in the first row. Okay, I will give you mine right now.
It makes me sad. I asked the question to everyone on Twitter. I said, where in the world does sex education well? Who does it really good? And I think the best is probably in the Nordics, like Sweden, but nowhere does it really well.
Yeah, right. I agree that on YouTube there are a lot of videos from Nordic schools where like how they educate kids and so on. I have a question to you. What is your thoughts about procreation function? Is it acceptable for humans that we'll exchange procreation function with technology in like nearest future and keep sex just like for pleasure when technology would care about like next generation?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I was actually having a conversation with my co-founder, and we like to think about these crazy things that are going to happen in the future. And one of the questions that he said, or one of the things that he said, is he said, I believe in the future we will grow babies outside the body. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. At the moment, we don't have the technology to do it, for sure. And also, there are many ethical, moral questions we would need to ask about that. But I can see why people might want that. I mean, growing a baby and having a baby can be very detrimental for many women and many men. So I see why people might want it. At the moment, I think we're way too early to think if that's going to actually happen. But some of the interesting things is that we're still doing a lot of research and we're still understanding more about how this happens and how we can help improve pregnancy and birth and child rearing for everyone. So there's, I think, a lot of medical research that is being done and how technology impacts that. There are some amazing... So, for example, in the US, I am going to sit with a company that does a hard piece of hardware that monitors contractions and helps nurses and doctors understand the birth process much better. So I think we are creating some small bits of technology, but yeah, there's a really interesting future ahead.
Okay, so the next question in the first row.
Hi.
Thanks. 2 years ago, the sex industry was affected by the scandal with the MysteryVibe. Also not a startup, but a company from the same domain as MysteryVibe. How MysteryVibe was affected by it? Have you changed the way you collect and process data from the applications and the devices?
Yeah, sure. So for anyone who doesn't know, there was a scandal about 2 years ago where a company that had sex toys and technology associated with that essentially didn't tell their customers that they were collecting data and storing it in a server, and then there was some kind of hack where that data was accessed, essentially. And there was a huge scandal and a big lawsuit. I think it was $5 million in the... So that affects the industry, obviously, because trust is one of the most important things when it comes to sex, not just between two people, but more broadly. In terms of how I see that, at the moment, we don't collect any data. That's not something we're involved in right now. I see it in our future, but not right now. And our very, very good friend, GDPR, very good friend, has provided some extra guidance about how we should be thinking about data security and data collection. And it's one of the things that I think is very interesting for sex because sex for a very long time has been based around the idea of consent. You don't have sex with someone who doesn't consent. Informed and enthusiastic consent. And so now we see the technology industry bringing some of the ideas around consent into, and I think that's a very good thing. But when it comes to when you're designing products and services for sex, you have to think about security by design, and you have to make sure that what you're designing is as secure as possible. Now, I don't think that we live in a world where anything is unhackable. I think everything is hackable to some extent. So you have to make sure you're designing things in a way that even if something was hacked, you minimize the possible problems. So at the moment, we're not collecting we don't collect data. That is something I see in our future. And so I'm very involved in how we design and implement security for that. But yeah, it's a super interesting question.
Okay, and we have time for the last question today. Okay, yeah, you.
Hello. That's very lovely look on the future development of tech. But let's go to the now. And you mentioned VR and toys combined together, and this market is completely emptier.
Yeah.
Well, there are a couple of examples, and also VR market is quite contested. There are few very interesting technologies. Can it be that first successful combination of sex toys and VR will completely overwhelm the whole market? What's your take on this?
I hope so.
I
think that would be really interesting. We're not working in VR at the moment. There's one company out of the Netherlands called Kiru who have built a very basic connection, but it's still very basic. I think that there are so many possibilities. I think that especially when we're thinking about sex and technology, it's not just about one sense. If you can create an experience, whether that's showing someone visuals or through touch or through smells or through temperature, it's a much more powerful way to have an experience. And so I'm excited for the ways in which different technologies, and we can talk about the internet of sex, the internet of sex tech, can combine together to create experiences. But for me, virtual reality is that really good example of how a technology can help us question things about ourselves and help us question what it means to be human and what it means to be sexual. So that's why I like talking about it. But yeah, I think if someone did a really good execution of haptic, tactile technology and a virtual space, yeah, I think it could be really interesting.
Thank you.
So, dear all, thank you for your questions. You can catch Stephanie after this speech. And Stephanie, thank you so much for your speech.
Thank you. Thank you.